Hey everyone, welcome back to another fantastic session. And I am so thrilled because there's a lot of people here to see the one and only Mr. Chris Do. What's up, Chris?
Hey, Tom, how's it going?
I'm really excited because this session's kind of different. We've been looking at logo design and brand identity, but we're almost going to take a step back today because I think at the root of all good brand design, all good logo design is typography ultimately. Mm-hmm. And I know today you're going to cover some ultimate fundamentals when it comes to that, right?
Yeah, that's the plan.
Cool. And this is going to be a presentation, but a kind of interactive one in some ways. So I'm really excited to see it. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, so this is my special typography manual design cuts edition here. So you guys, I've prepared an Illustrator artboard. So I'm going to be stepping through my slides, talking to you a little bit about some of the rules, telling some stories. And along the way, I'm going to do some live design. I've not done this before. And if you see something or you want to engage and interact with either Tom or myself, just make sure you put it in the chat. I'm not going to be able to read the chat, but Tom will do that for me on my behalf. And Tom, just pretend like you're one of my students, and we're doing a one-on-one coaching, mentoring session on design, which I've never done anything like this before. So let's get into it. So this is my artboard. So I'm going to just go through this. And the first thing I want to do is share this quote from Saul Bass. And I've appropriated this quote and I've changed it a little bit, but the original quote is design is thinking made visible. I've just changed it to typography is thinking made visible because that's how passionate I am about type. And to me, if you were to ask me, how does one get better at design, which is a question I have to field quite often, I will say, well, the secret to design is through typography. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about this, okay? So before I do that, I want to show you some of the work of one of the most amazing typographers, a Swiss graphic designer. His name is Joseph Müller-Brockmann. And this is some of his work. And you've seen this work. It's super iconic. And it's very graphic. And if you ever design a poster or a layout like this, I think you should be very happy with yourself because there's so many cool, very interesting things going on underneath all of this stuff that glues it together, the grids and the way that they're proportioned and spaced out, all these components, it's all very well thought out, like you would expect from a Swiss graphic design master. Now, the story is something like this. I go to Art Center. And I remember very distinctly walking through the student gallery, which is phenomenal because the graphic design department and the other departments that curate the very best of the best work. So to have your work in the gallery is an accomplishment. So I walk by there through the graphic design section and I look at this work and I'm just marveled by the beautiful typography, the layouts, the juxtaposition of image and type. And I was just thinking to myself, one day I want to be this good. Right. One day, hopefully, I can be this good. So I'm going to jump forward in the story here. The story moves forward, and I'm in Simon Johnston's Type 1 class. This is the third semester at Art Center. And I'm learning how to use type through these very reductive, minimalistic exercises that are super repetitive. Just use one typeface, and he tells you what typeface it is, one point size, and one weight, and do 15 layouts. 15 layouts? I don't know if I could do 3, but grinding through this week after week, and he would unlock one variable, it really made you master the components. So I go back to the gallery and I think to myself, a different story. And that story is, I feel like now, not only can I do work that is this good, I could do work that's better than this. Now, this may sound like really cocky for a young design student to say this, but that's how it felt. It felt like somebody gave me the key that unlocks all the world of design. Or how Neo in the Matrix, when he understands that he's in a program and he sees that code streaming down, that beautiful type, and he can see things for what they are. That's what
your tutor's there like, do you believe it now, Chris?
You got to say that with more bass in your voice. Okay. So that's what it did for me. And that's why I'm such a champion or proponent for understanding typography. And once you understand how to design with type, because you're now much more aware of form, space, negative space, repetition, and contrast, I felt like now I could design a table or a room or a building. And Massimo Vignelli has a saying, it's like, if you can design one thing, you can design everything. So isn't that kind of very promising, the lure of understanding design in all of its applications? It's pretty cool. And this foundation of understanding type and design has led me to a very long and lucrative career in doing many different things. And I have literally designed buildings and interiors before for my clients. So I'm going to keep going here, but I want to set the tone and intention for our call today. Yeah.
What I'm thinking here, Chris,
Yes.
is it's really interesting to me when a design fundamental like this maps out to really quite a varied career that you've had. It makes me think of how Steve Jobs used calligraphy, right? He mastered that fundamental principle and practice, and then that created the Mac OS and all of these wonderful things.
Yeah, I mean, mastering calligraphy might be a stretch to describe Steve Jobs. I think
you know what I mean.
He was introduced to the concepts of calligraphy, which made him really appreciate design. He credits calligraphy as just attuning his sensibility to form and space.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting note of yours, though, how that can spread into so many different mediums outside of what you originally have an interest in.
Yeah, once you become aware of this, it's impossible to unsee it. And this is why so many designers will sit there and look at things and say, well, that's a little bit off, or I would have made that point size a little bit smaller, or the interline, interword spacing is a little funky, or your kerning is off. They'll say things like that because once you become aware, you can't unsee it. You're Neo.
I love that.
You took the pill, right? So you can see everything now. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing. All right, hopefully I can do this on this monitor. Okay.
Yeah, the sharing can be kind of funny. There we go.
Yeah. All right. So this is Joseph Mueller-Brockman's work, and these are some other designs that he produced. And you can see here, without adding imagery or illustration, it's still super powerful. Even in his use of overlapping colors and type, we can still read the title itself, and it's very well proportioned and balanced. And it's doing something. There's asymmetrical balance and beauty to this. So prior to the modern era of graphic design, the standards of beauty were centered layouts with serif typefaces. And so this is kind of a radical departure as we're seeing all these designers emerge in the early part of the century and just playing around with type and moving things around. And there's just a dynamism to it. And you can see these offset parts. But here's the really cool thing, because I've actually done this. And this is a tip here's the first tip for the day, is if you like a layout, put a piece of tracing paper over it or tissue and use a ruler and pen and just start drawing grid lines across anything that's connected to anything. And you'll be shocked and surprised at how much things conform to a grid. And another Massimo quote here is that grids are meant to be felt and not seen. It's like your underwear is there for support, but it's not meant to be seen. Massimo has so many of these like wonderful, delightful quotes, right? And okay, so today I'm going to focus on some simple rules to help you become a better designer. And this is interactive, so I'll be talking and moving things around in a little bit, not just yet. And we'll go as deep as you guys can bear. Hopefully I won't bore you to death. But what we're trying to do is achieve some balance between legibility, which is very important, but not the penultimate goal, not always, while creating interest. And let me talk about that a little bit. Imagine a scale with on the left side is legibility. Is it readable? Can people understand what the heck you're doing? And on the other side is interesting. Now, if it's super legible, but it has no interest, people would say that's really boring. And you can see a lot of government forms are like this. If you've ever been served by an attorney for a lawsuit, no fun. I have. Yeah, I could read it all, but this is not a well-designed document because it just purely conveys information. It's kind of like when you understand the dictionary definition of a word, yeah, you do that, but that's not magical. There's no interpretation. It's until you understand it, use it in a sentence, and you mix it up creatively, that then you own the word. And then people like poets and hip hop artists who are able to combine words in unexpected ways, it really makes you think about the meaning of the word. Now, on the other side of that scale, if the pendulum swings to the right, is interest. Now, you could make something really interesting, but if you make it impossible for me to read and to understand and decipher, then then the words become art and paint and not words anymore. Now, where you sit on that spectrum, after you understand the fundamentals, you get to decide. And you have to understand that if you don't stop somebody from scrolling or in the street looking at a poster, then there's no chance for them to look at the message. So the designer has to walk this tightrope of like pulling you in, and just imagine yourself balancing on a slack line. Like, I got to pull you in and once I get you there, while I have your attention, I still need you to read it. So
it's kind of easier said than done as well, right?
What's that?
It's kind of easier said than done as well.
Yes, of course.
It can be really tricky.
It is easier said than done. Yes, it can be. So here's what happens. You have a lot of keyboard warriors out there, designers who think, oh, I know what design is. So all they can do is critique, is it legible? Is it legible? Yes, it can be legible. A monkey can make it legible. But that's not the real challenge. And I make a point of this because I'm going to go back to Joseph Mueller Brockman. And you can see that this takes a little bit more work to read. You might not read their film. You might not be able to read that. But I can. And in my mind, I'm trying to unlock the meaning of this combination in these words. And it's like, wow, it's really beautiful. And when I do, I get this sense of like, I'm in on the joke. We're speaking the same language.
Mm-hmm. Right?
And that's kind of what you want to be able to do. It's a balance of legibility and visual interest. So in this layout here, if this type that exists right here were just the only thing on the page, it's still pretty interesting to me. But the fact that he has these rectangular boxes and it really follows kind of golden ratio proportions here, once you lay it out, you'll see it. It's really interesting. There's very strong grid lines, and Swiss and grids, they're almost synonymous to me. The Swiss really rely heavily on the grid, and everything's boxes and alignment. And there's a certain beauty that you can appreciate from looking at most of their design. Okay, let's get into it. All right, so one of the principles that we really need to understand is this thing about repetition and contrast, or order and chaos, or consonance and dissonance if you're talking about music. Mm-hmm. And what do I mean by that? Is if you have a bunch of sounds, from borrowing from what I can remember from music history class, if a cat in an alleyway jumps off the garbage can, knocks over a bottle, and gets into a fight with another cat, and you're trying to get some sleep, that's not going to make the most pleasant notes for you to listen to, because they're random and there's no structure. Crash, screech, bang. So there's no repetition there. However, if you are trying to sleep again, and the sink, you have a leaky sink, the faucet, drip, 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 that's repetition. But without variance to that drip, that can drive you crazy. And that's actually one form of torture, to do something over and over again. So again, we're talking about this balance, this push and pull, the yin and yang of repetition, having enough predictable elements, and then having a surprise.
It's really funny you just mentioned that, Chris.
Yeah.
Guess what my fiance played on her phone last night to help us get to sleep?
What is that?
It was a soundscape of some rain.
Yeah.
Because it had repetitious elements, but it wasn't just like a perpetual drip. It had enough variance to kind of have that middle ground.
Right. I think she's playing some white noise for you, right?
So yeah, nearly. It
becomes something you hear and you don't hear. So the laundry machine can do that for you. Rain on a roof, on a tin roof, sounds pretty good. The waves crashing on the beach, that kind of rhythm, but with enough variance. I wouldn't call it musical, but that I put that in the white noise kind of category that helps you to kind of zone out. Okay. Hopefully people are not listening and watching this and saying this is kind of like that white noise. I don't typically ever give presentations using Adobe Illustrator, but there's a reason why. It's because I want to make it interactive and hopefully give you some things to think about, some theory and some application. It's kind of like my whole life, a little bit of theory, a little bit of doing. Okay. And there's this French composer, I believe his name is Claude Debussy, and he has this line and describes music as the space between the notes. And now you start to understand the repetition and the contrast. So if you have a beat, and then you skip the beat, or you vary the beats, that's where the music comes in, the musicality, okay? So just keep that in mind, because I'm going to tell you a bunch of tips and rules, but you can't just be a robot and follow the rules and expect it to be great. So it's the human part where you decide where to put negative space. Now, if I zoom out here, you'll notice my artboard is actually kind of big. It's 1920 by 1080. And notice how I'm not trying to fill up the entire space. And also that, let me draw a box here. You'll also notice that the amount of space I'm using, and what we want to do is once you start to understand design, you have to vary the space. It's not even centered in the page. And if you draw boxes up here too, which I'm going to, you'll notice the spacing. Let me do this so it's a little bit more precise. Now, after I've been doing or laying out type for years, I'm not sitting here drawing a grid line for everything, because now I have a sense of it needs more or less space. Notice the variation of what's going on. So I'm going to, let me group this. I'm going to hide it, okay? Notice the proportion of this versus this. This is more than 3 times as big as that, and that's kind of important. So symmetrical beauty used to be the standard. Asymmetrical beauty is the standard today for modern design. So let me bring that back. Now you can see here the variance.
It's kind of like in
space.
cinema. Sorry to interject. Like the rule of 2/3 is used in cinema, right? It's much more common than just straight down the center.
Yeah, and if you want to do something that's centered, you like look right into the camera, and everything in frame is symmetrical. Wes Anderson is famous for composing his shots like this. So is I'm spacing on his name right now. There are a couple like really amazing directors where they spend an inordinate amount of time just lining everything up, and that's the kind of beauty itself. And we feel like comfortable there. But to me, it's like this asymmetry. And if you could look at this right now, and you can say, like, if these black shapes were a building, the facade of a building, where this is maybe a 30 floor building, that the first floor, the ground floor, is down here at the bottom. And then if they were just to do some paneling like this, it could be kind of interesting. This kind of rhythm, as opposed to something like this, which I'll show you in a second. So if I have a building that looks like this, and I'm going to just move this up and duplicate this. Okay, so let's say these are 2 buildings, the one on the left and the one on the right, and you're looking at the facade, and you are a human and you're just as tall as one of these letters, right? Like this 2 here, and you're looking at this. Which one's more interesting to you? Now, if you are just a stickler for grids and uniform and repetition, you're like the building on the right. But then you'll notice that a lot of the buildings today are designed a little bit differently. And the modern ones by the world famous star architects, are more like the one on the left. So you can see this idea of repetition and the space between the notes is being played out here. Now, I'm going to show you one other thing here. What if this building had parts that were cantilevered, like if we're offset, like here? So we're taking a basic unit, 1 floor, and we're varying the amounts of space it takes, and then we're also offsetting things, and that might be kind of interesting. Or you might say, well, you know what, I don't like that. What if we just brought out 1 floor, like created a sky deck? So the building is still pretty much uniform, but there's one area that's pushed over, so it creates space over here for people to kind of enjoy the outdoors, and over here. So that's when you start to tie these things together in terms of understanding space and form, and you can design anything at this point. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about alignment now. So I have 3 examples here. I'm going to zoom in. Hopefully you guys can see it. I'll hide my tools. Hopefully I can bring them back. Okay, so let's talk about alignment here. So I'm zoomed in here, and we can see this is the same amount of copy, and this is just Greek text and lorem ipsum. And there's a website called Hipster Ipsum, and it just has funny words like hot chicken food truck, organic kale, selvage, things that are very trendy in the hipster world,
I've
right?
never seen that.
Okay, yeah. So instead of using boring lorem ipsum, you could use hipster ipsum. Okay, so I just copied the paragraph in here, and I just want to point out a few things. Now, there are a couple of ways to align your text. So there's a grid, there's a column here, and the text is placed inside. And the first one is flush right, rag left. So you would write that flush left, or flush right, which is FR, rag left, RL. Maybe I should write that. Let me do that. Okay.
Cool. So we got flush right,
Yeah.
rag
So this
left,
is flush right.
I bet some people are just hearing the term rag for the first time in this context.
Rag left. Yeah. Okay. And so you can see that there's a certain order to this. There's a crisp right edge there, and that's kind of nice. And we're going to look at the next one here. This is just centered. So this is centered, and centered, like I said, has that classic vibe to it. Now, we're lucky here in that the point size relative to the width of the column of the paragraph is so much so that there's very little variance to this thing. But if I were to hit return here, you can see the centered component of this a little bit more easily. It makes a shape and it's symmetrical. And remember, this was the standard of beauty in Europe for many, many years. Now, the third one here is, I think it's just called justified or force justified, which means that the left and right edges are sharp. And there's a couple things, like you've seen all these kinds of layouts before. So some movie posters, especially the credit block at the bottom with all the stars' names, the producers, and all the people that are important, they're usually centered on the poster. And there's certain conventions too, like when you see a movie will display credits like this. And let me do it here. You notice movies, they have a center layout.
Yeah.
And everything on the left is rag left. And everything on the right is rag right. And I've tried changing these layouts before because I've designed main titles. And I actually found it actually hard to read. So somewhere people have experimented with this and they figured out, for the audience sake, in terms of trying to get through as many credits as possible and make it easy to find, if your eye stays in the center, you can quickly scan for the credit that you care about, and before it leaves the screen, you can read it. And if you try this, if I do this to it, so there's two paragraphs, I have to look for this corner and I'm looking for that corner, and because the titles and the names are so different in width, it becomes really, really hard to read. So that's why they do that. Okay. And if I were to approximate that, it'd probably look a little bit more like that, right? Like the credit. Okay, I'm going to delete this. Number 3 is justified. And you're going to see this most often used in newspapers and magazines. For whatever reason, they think this just looks better. But I'm going to point out a couple of things. Let me bring back my tools.
I historically don't like justified because you get all these weird gaps and inconsistencies.
Yeah. So I want to point out something to everybody who's watching here. You see this note at the bottom here? You'll notice in Western culture, we read from the top to the bottom. So we're scanning the page top to bottom, and then we read left to right. Now, some cultures read top to bottom, right to left. And I don't know how many other ways there is from bottom to top and right to left. So it's very important that you understand who you're designing this thing for. And you notice, like, if you go to a Japanese newsstand, all the magazines are flipped backwards. But it's not backwards. That's right reading for them, wrong reading for us. So the cover is actually on the back side, and they read that direction. So it's kind of interesting. These are just customs. Nothing is good or bad, relatively speaking, but it's just how people have been accustomed to do this. So now that we understand, if we're designing this for an American, Western European audience, you're going to see that we read from top to bottom. So our eye is scanning from here, and it's going across here, and it's going to go down, right? So look at the way your eye moves. That's what's happening right now. Now it goes from here. We could go over to here, but more likely we're going to read this. Okay. And here's the part that why flush right, rag left is hard to read. It's because our eye is working a little bit harder to find these corners. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story in a second, but You see that right there? A little harder to read because
Mhm.
we're searching, and every little bit of that slows this down. And if you're laying out something in a book, you'll notice this. Tom, have you ever had this happen where you're reading a book and you reread the same line over again?
Yeah, especially if you're kind of tired, doing some revision at college or something.
Yeah. So according to designers that design books, if that happens, that's a failure of the designer, unless you're just totally spacing out, and that the width of the paragraph is maybe too long, so you're losing your sense. So watch what happens here. If I'm reading this word Santo and I come over here, and if it's so wide, I forget where it begins again, right? And I can show you example, but just imagine this column width. I guess I don't have to make you imagine. Like imagine if it were that wide. By the time you finish the line over here and you come back to the other side, you've lost your way. And you don't want to do that as a designer.
It's surprisingly fatiguing, actually, when it's laid out
Yeah.
poorly. It's an exhausting exercise just to read.
Yes. Okay. Now, when it comes to centered layout, you have the exact same problem. You're still looking for those hard, crisp edges to read. And we're going to make a vase face here. Just copy that. So let me scoot this over. Okay. So you're having this kind of symmetrical component to it. Like I said, it's considered beautiful for a certain period of time, and it can be used time in history, and it can be used still successfully. A lot of advertising advertisements are like this. And if you go to the Apple website, almost all the text in their main landing pages have centered type. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so we'll get back to that. So it's a little harder to read. Now, justified text, so we're seeing here, I'll zoom in, has this really nice, sharp edge. I can't even draw a straight line, but now you're not hunting anymore. Okay, but it creates a new kind of problem. If I really zoom in here, you're going to see a new problem. You're going to see that in order for it to get sharp edges on the left and the right, it inserts spaces between the words that are inconsistent. So what's happening is a river runs through it. And you're going to see these things. So when you become very sensitive to what's going on the page, you'll also start to notice these things. And it can get really obnoxious. If, for example, if the sentence were to end here, I guess I can't do that. Okay, because if I hit return, it'll just do it like this. But this is normal letter spacing and word spacing, and this is not. So it's making all these adjustments. So I don't really like that either for body copy. It can be used for great effect if you're trying to just make a shape. But really what you want to do is you just want to make this flush left, rag right. That is ideally set for legibility and for reading. Okay, so that's just a little rule. So when you're designing something, for people who are still new in design or perhaps didn't have a great typography teacher in school, I'm just going to tell you, when in doubt, flush left or justify left. Left, left, justified. Okay? I was going to try to write a song, but I'm not that good at songwriting to help people remember that. When you don't know what to do, just maintain that crisp left edge. All right? Otherwise, you create rivers, you create shapes inadvertently, because we have no control over this. Whoever wrote these words, a computer did, but whoever wrote these words then determined the shape, not the designer. All right, that's enough on alignment. Let's keep moving on. Now I want to talk about spacing here. Okay, let me get this color back. All right, so let's talk about spacing. Now, you have a lot of control as a designer, how much spacing to put in between each letter, in between each word, and in between each line. There's some technical terms for it, but it's called inter-letter spacing, inter-word spacing, or interline spacing. And getting this right so that it's legible and pleasant to look at. There's some formulas that I've included here that you can use, right? And the formula is that for For maximum legibility with a decent typeface that's got a nice big X height, you want to have about 60 to 70 characters per line. That's ideal. Too long, too short becomes a little harder to read. So let's look at this one. Now this is called interline spacing, I believe, or leading, because they used to insert pieces of lead on the press. So when the leading is too tight, you'll notice it becomes much harder to read. It's even fatiguing to the eye just to look at, because the descenders and ascenders of the typeface start to run into each other. All right. And then this, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say we had some great sessions outlining letter forms with things like ascenders and descenders. And so it applies equally to hand lettering as it does with fonts, guys. You know, you're going to encounter a lot of the same problems.
Yes, absolutely. So to me, the difference between lettering and typography, and there is a big difference, and there's even differences within the lettering world, like building up a letter form or calligraphy. Those are two different disciplines, and we'll talk about that if you want. But if you think about lettering as just designing one word, typography is putting the words together to make a thought, and it's quite different. All right. And so if we look at this here, number 2, we can see that there's a lot of leading, and also the column width is much wider. So this is what I was talking before about, like when you have so many letters across here, it becomes harder to remember like where you are as you return to the other side, as your eyes are scanning. The other thing is you start to notice this, which is you start to stare at the negative space, and that is distracting from you reading the words itself. And in example number 3 here, chicken food, we can see that there's a lot of leading, and there's even increased tracking, which is the space between characters, and the column width is very narrow. So you can see these two have the same leading, but this has much tighter tracking, the bottom one, where the letters are tracked together really tightly. And yeah, it creates a nice visual texture if you're just like painting in shapes, but once you become super hyper aware, each one
I got
of
a
these
question actually, Chris. So when it comes to using these different theories around spacing and different techniques in a deliberate fashion, outside of like a Swiss type poster, I'm thinking more in day-to-day real world settings. Should people be abiding by some fairly strict rules for like ultimate balance, or would you be deliberately making it perhaps a bit more stressful to read? Would you be playing with these things for a desired effect, is what I'm asking. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And the answer is it depends. It depends entirely on the context. So if you're driving by in a car and you see these posters, you have a split second to kind of see it, and it needs to grab your attention. So it needs to be both visually interesting and highly legible. So this is where clients and sometimes designers are complicit in this, is that they allow and agree to have too much type on a poster. And a poster is a format that's meant to be seen at a distance. So all that little copy trying to like cram in there that you want to write, it's going to hurt the design. So posters, like movie posters, are a pretty good example, or when they're launching a new album or something, or a new TV show, you'll notice it's very image driven, because that'll catch my eye. There's usually a bright color, lots of contrast, which we'll talk about. And they have just one big word or 2 words and a phrase. That's it. And then if you're so interested, they'll put the URL at the bottom or launch date or something. And that's as much as you're going to put on a poster. So the poster's main problem is to grab your attention in a world that's too noisy. But when you're reading
a really
book,
good example of this, Chris, actually.
You do?
Jack Daniels. So I've seen some Jack Daniels giant posters on like a billboard or something, where it has to be very minimal and like you say, minimal text, huge spacing to be super legible. You got other ones where it's a Jack Daniels poster on the London Underground, and it's these reams of text because they know people are going to be there for at least 2 minutes waiting for their train. So they give you like the life story of like old Jack, you know, and his family will work in the whiskey barrels, and they tell a whole narrative because you're there just staring forward with nothing else to do.
Yeah. I'll show you an example right now. Okay. I in the time that we're doing that, I'm going to show you an example right here. So let me paste something in. Okay. This is a poster for Nike. They probably have some of the most consistent design and branding for a gigantic corporation. Now, I want to ask our audience for a little bit. What is this poster saying? Don't say it yet, Tom. What is this poster saying? The question I have for you now is, once you're able to read it, how did it make you feel? Was it delightful? Was it frustrating? Or something in between? And I think it's like this puzzle that the designer made for you to solve. Not a hard puzzle. It's not like a Rubik's Cube, but it's a puzzle. And when you solve it, there's a little sense of delight. Like, oh, I get it. I'm smart. I'm in on the joke. There's a secret language, and I'm able to figure it out. You might even tap somebody's shoulder, like that, or like, hey, read that. What does that say? Like, that license plate game where you have vanity plates and people try to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Now, here's the problem with the internet. I don't mean the smart people that are attending this session right now. Of course, they're very smart. But the general internet, everybody outside of this bubble, they're kind of silly because they'll see something like this. Well, I can't read it. This is stupid. This is really like a bad designer. This designer should go to jail. It's because they don't understand anything about design. Somebody putting this together with uneven spacing, like line spacing and character spacing, taking the word wit and taking witness, and flipping it upside down in New York City in this kind of somewhat symmetrical but asymmetrical layout, it's super cool. And I bet you, I don't know this for a fact, that this has won a bunch of design awards. If you saw this on the street and you walked by, it's hard not to notice this thing. It looks industrial. Like somebody cut up one of these signs, these warning signs like hazard, do not walk past, and they just put it in there.
You know what? It's not safe.
Yes?
And I just saw in the comments, it was almost quite divisive. So some people loved it and other people found it frustrating. But at least it elicits a reaction, because if a design is bland and boring and people pass it by, then it hasn't served its purpose.
It has not. So here's what you do. If I were to sit here and design this witness at New York City, I'd just keep working on this because there's not a lot of words here. And you're trying to use the space in a way that's interesting. And over time, those people who hate this, you'll start to learn. Like, once you really understand typography and you know how to master and manipulate it, you'll start to learn, and you'll come around. You'll watch this episode again 5 years from now when you've done enough typography and design, and you'll say to yourself, wow, I've come full circle. Okay. So let's get back into it. Yeah. So where were we? We're over here. Yeah. All right. So according to people who research legibility, 9 to 12 points in terms of type units is most legible for a normal distance in reading, like a book. Like from your head to your table, if you're holding a book in front of you, that's the most legible point size. If it gets too big, it becomes a little harder to read. And if it becomes too small, of course, then people that are nearsighted like myself are going to find it very hard to read as well. Okay, so we talked about that. So those are 2 tips. That does not mean every book that you design has to be 9 to 12 point in type size. It doesn't need to be that way. But what we want to do is we want to understand what people have been spending a lot of time figuring out before we break the rules. We don't want to just break them because we're ignorant. We break them because we know that that's the case, but we know how to resolve that. And maybe we'll have time to explore that together. No guarantees. All right. Let's talk about weight and width. Now, all 3 examples here have diminished legibility. It's harder to read these things. When you have body copy and you use a really heavy weight, and I think this is like extra bold. This is Helvetica now, extra bold. Yep. Okay. And it's fatiguing. You look at it, it takes up a lot of ink. So even just for consideration, when you lay down a lot of ink on paper, the page is going to be a little bit heavier than it was. When I was in junior high school, my instructor for woodshop class asked the class, do you know why they don't paint the Golden Gate Bridge, which is a famous bridge here in Northern California? And they said, well, why don't they paint that all in one go? They only paint half the bridge at one time. And everybody was just like trying to throw out different guesses. And he said the reason why they don't do that is the paint is so heavy, it compromises the structure of the bridge, because so much paint is laid down on the bridge. So they just paint a part of it at a time as they go. Weird.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, me neither. And I hope that's true.
That's like
what he told me in junior
question. High. I like it.
Yeah. I think I was like 14 when he said that. Okay. Anyways, the second one is using a typeface called Dido or Dido. And it's got really contrasting serifs. The thick and thin of it is really pushed to the edge. So the serif, I'm going to zoom in here. It's just a little hairline. I want to zoom into it like this, and you can see it looks actually really beautiful. But for body copy, at this point size, at this distance, it starts to break apart. That those thin serifs or transitions are starting to fall apart. So if you're going to use very cheap printing and on a terrible paper stock, you're not going to use this for body copy. But for large display type, it's excellent. It's beautiful. Armani Exchange comes to mind. AX. You guys know AX? Let me grab this. I'll paste it here.
And right, this is interesting because this is really one of the greatest fonts ever, but it can still be problematic at certain sizes.
Look at that. That looks
nice.
Beautiful. And even next to this, it looks really amazing, right? But this is not an appropriate typeface for body copy. So we just need to know these things. Like every typeface has its strengths and weaknesses. And even the ones that you guys love to hate, there's still beautiful design out there. You just need to learn how to do it. Okay. The last one here is Trade Gothic Next Compressed. And it has a smaller character width relative to its height. And it is also really hard to read. So we don't want to use compressed typeface or condensed typeface for body copy. But let's take this typeface and let's do something with it. I'll write the word headline. Headline. Maybe I'll even do this in all caps. It'd be great if I could spell. Okay. And I scale this up.
This is your Instagram font, right?
It's not.
Which one's your Instagram font?
Oh, it's a secret.
No, it's not.
No, I'm just kidding. It's not. It's not a secret. I tell everybody what it is. See, so if you use it at appropriate size, it also is handsome, right? And there's things I could do with this, like headline. What's today's date? October, what is it?
The 15th.
15th. Okay. So if I can take this, I can scale it down. Smaller. Put this up here. And there's little things I can do to this to make it really nice, right? Like I can even add a rule here. And a rule is just a line, single line. We're live designing here, and people always get nervous when I live design because I do crazy things and they're like, wow, it's not appropriate. I don't like that design. Like, you know, whatever. Okay. So now you can see like, oh, that's kind of maybe interesting. So you'll notice that I'm making these little adjustments all the time because I'm aware that, let me grab my red pen again. Because I'm aware that every time I add an element, it's creating a relationship, whether I intend to or not, between all these things. And it's a constant push and pull. You change one thing, it affects everything else. I've been recently quoted saying this, so it's like when you start with a blank page, it's perfect. Everything you add on there makes it imperfect, so you better know what you're doing. right? So when you have
That's a good quote.
one square on a page, it's like, okay, that looks pretty good. And then you add a circle to that page. Now there's a relationship that exists between that square and that circle. Is the circle too big? Is the square too small? And you kind of have to, it's just push and pull. Okay.
When I first started learning design, I learned by trying to copy better pieces of design work, and often really minimal ones, and it would frustrate me so much where I think like there's just like a couple of lines of text and a shape on that poster. Why does theirs look beautiful and mine is like almost exactly the same, but mine looks terrible? And it would just come down to these really subtle nuances.
Yeah. What's your background, by the way, Tom?
It's more web design, to be honest. So
Okay.
I wish I'd had this kind of classical studying of typography. I never did design at college, but yeah, very much like the web design side of things.
I see.
And I love like the branding side of business as well. It's super fun to me.
Beautiful. Okay. So we have some examples there. So these, because I just chose the wrong typeface. And when I say wrong, I only mean for this application for body copy, that it makes it harder for people to read. And after a while, people do get frustrated with this kind of stuff, and then they just move on. But I'm going to show you something here. I'm probably messing it up for myself. I'm going off script here. Not that there is really a script, but I'm going to go here. I'm select this text, and I'm going to change this from bold to light. Now look how much more pleasant this looks, because it's got this bold first sentence, like some bombastic statement like hot chicken food truck organic fixie. And then I've got the rest of this green juice master cleanse kale chips.
Weirdly, Chris does that every time we do a session together. It's got a real thing about hot chicken.
Yes. So you can see there that just by creating different weights and juxtaposing the two together, it actually makes it really interesting. And it's just about the law of contrast, and we'll go more into that. Now, I did mention something earlier, and I didn't forget, but about center type. Let's pull it up. Hopefully I don't have anything weird on my computer. All right. My Safari, where's Safari? All right, so sorry for everybody. I'm an Apple loyalist, so I'm gonna go to Apple. Still see this, right?
All good. I'm definitely an Apple fan as well.
Okay, look at all this type. It's all centered. It's all centered, and there's no crazy rags either. And I'll tell you what's happening here. My theory is this: is that first of all, they have amazing copywriters that are working in tandem with the designers. It's not like the copy department writes the text and then ships it over to the designer and says, good luck, see you later. So they work together, because if this isn't looking good, the copywriter they'll just go in and change the words. They'll add a longer word or hyphenate the word. They'll change things. And unless you're the copywriter and the designer, you're going to want to have that kind of relationship. But here's the thing that why this is kind of interesting for us to talk about. Open this back up. Okay, is something that modern web designers have to contend with, which is varying screen sizes. And it's, let me close this honey tip here. Come on, honey. All right. We have to design type in a very frustrating way that we have to kind of accommodate all kinds of screen sizes, from your iPhone to an iMac Pro, which is what I'm running right now. And that means that it has to be responsive. So the layout starts to break when you change it from a really wide display to a really narrow display, unless the type is centered. Because when it's justified, flush left or flush right, it becomes a lot harder for us to deal with. So if we have a central axis where everything is anchored on, it just makes everything that much easier to look at. So it still looks good.
About Apple as a brand that's very beautifully symmetrical, it seems. So it kind of fits with that general aesthetic of the company.
Yeah, there's a couple other things here that's working for it too. The quality of the photography is just top notch, bar none. So if you had designed something like this where you actually are not the copywriter as well, you're going to have some weird rags and breaks, and your photography is going to suck. It's going to be clip art or stock photos, and it's not going to look very good. And then people come to your site and it's like, it's really boring. Mm-hmm. Like every part of this has been carefully thought out. Like if I were to click on this, let me go to this page. So it's a leap year, less bezel, more screen, and then kicks glass. Pretty clever, Apple. you copywriters, you, right? And you'll have like really boring generic type. No, I mean, I can only imagine how many thousands of dollars they spent to take this photo and to retouch it. And I know this because I know photographers who have done work for Apple, and they pay a lot. It's very expensive because they want every little bezel and reflection to be perfect. So oftentimes they're taking like 15 photos and stitching them together to achieve these results.
Wow.
Yeah, every little part's labored over. All right, so that's enough about Apple. Let's get back to the lesson at hand. Okay, that's why they do centered. Okay, another thing I want you to be aware of is upper and lower case. Now, I'm just going through some foundational stuff. I assume that if you're tuning in, I'm gonna just think that, okay, you're still relatively new to design. I'm gonna teach you some type. If not, you wouldn't be here, okay? Because you already know what you're doing. So let's talk about how we read things. So the case for lowercase. So here we are again, the hot chicken food truck. It's everywhere. You can see in all caps, same point size, same weight. Notice something? Takes up a lot more space. Just these two may be hard for some people to believe, but it's exactly the same point size. But doesn't the all caps look bigger? And it is literally bigger because it takes up more space. But I'll highlight it so that you can see it's 48 point type. So if you're trying to conserve space, using all uppercase will eat up that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the caps immediately feels like a headline or something with the hierarchy.
Yes, and if you want something to grab somebody's attention, use all caps. If it's not meant to take all that attention, then don't use upper lowercase or sentence or title casing. Okay, so the other thing that we need to know is that once we learn how to read, we're actually not reading the letters and trying to figure it out in our head anymore. That would take too much effort and it would slow down our reading. So what we really notice are the shapes. So if I were to zoom out really, really far out, right, you can see and read the shape combination before you can actually make out the individual letters. And people who research this, that where our lives depend on, like freeway signs,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be able to recognize that shape. And sometimes they make bad decisions on this. And I wrote about this in one of my Instagram posts. Okay. So just realize that we're going to see these shapes, and some of the shapes are a lot easier to read, but in all caps, because the baseline and the cap line are flush with the letters, it's just one giant block. So when you look at the word hot chicken food truck, if I put in the word maybe hot dog chicken food truck, which maybe makes sense. The word hot and dog have 3 letters. They both have an O, a round form in the middle, right? And squinting your eyes, it just becomes harder to read, especially if you're trying to look for the hamburger. No, I'm just kidding. It just becomes harder to read. I was trying to throw a type joke in there, but it didn't work out. Okay. So what you guys just need to know is this. Tom is like snickering in the back there. Is that using all caps retards reading and uses significantly greater amounts of space. You just need to know that, and that's it. So if you're,
it makes sense.
If you wind up typesetting everything in uppercase, and then you're just asking the person just read a little bit more, spend a little bit more effort to read it. Nothing wrong with that. I just need you to be aware of that. That's all. Right? Just like in a Kanye West song, I don't know if you're aware I'm a wolf. So I just want you to be aware of it. Okay.
I feel like you're dying to have a little rap today, Chris. This could be an exclusive.
No, I mean, type can be really dry, right? We're just 2 nerds here talking about type with a bunch of other nerds here. So we got to try to make it fun a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Chris actually promised before he joined us today, the final 5 minutes of today's session is going to be entirely in rap form. So
yes,
you heard it here first, people.
Yes, and Tom will be doing the live beatboxing to it.
It's a talent of mine. What can I say?
Yeah. Okay. Remember before I said, like, okay, there are 3 elements on the page. Now we're cheating a little bit because you notice I have the footer type and then this little type up here. So if we had nothing on this page, it would really just be 3 elements. And I'll answer this question here. A lot of people ask me, like, why on my carousels do I have this type at the bottom, the footer type and the header type. What's the function of that? Well, it serves two functions, but really the main function is one of aesthetics. That when you have something like this, and I'll turn off this layer. Where's my layers? Turn off the bottom. When you just have this, how does that feel to you?
It feels less grounded, I guess. Like I like the framing elements of the bottom text.
Yeah. So it feels less interesting, less grounded. And when you put this in, so Tom associates different feelings about this. And the reason why I have the mouse type or this footer type on my designs is because it provides contrast. So what we want to do is we want to have contrast. So this type is that big, while this type is just this little big. So when you have something really big next to something really small, the bigger thing seems bigger and the smaller thing seems smaller. That's why some people that are taller will travel with shorter people. That's why beautiful people like to travel with ugly people. It's just the way it works. It's like I look better next to you. I'm a little slimmer next to somebody who's a little heavier, and that's just the law of contrast, because it's comparative and contextual, and we see that, and we understand that. So having some detail provides that little spark, like somebody's paying attention. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So if
this
you,
is basically us when we meet at conferences, Chris. People comment on how I'm a giant, but you're incredibly good looking. So there you go.
Well played. Well played. I appreciate that. Okay. Now, if you were to go out, okay, are you kind of like a fashionista kind of person, Tom?
I mean, I'm wearing sweatpants out of shot right now, if that answers your question. I have my moments. I'm English. We like to dress fairly smartly.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you go out, like men don't have as many ways to accessorize their look, but you notice like if a guy goes out with a shirt and an untucked shirt with a pair of jeans and just loafers, and it's just like, what? Well, are you a designer? What's going on here? And then you tuck in your shirt, you look a little sharper, and you match the pair of shoes, and it's okay, you're looking a little sharper. And then you put on a jacket, like a suit jacket. It's like, oh, he's looking a little bit better. And then you put on a vest, and now you're wearing a 3-piece suit, and then all of a sudden you look really, really sharp. But you're missing something. What are you missing? Maybe a tie, an ascot, or maybe a little pocket square. You see, you got there. And the pocket square will have a pattern, a bold color, some kind of like print to it, so that you don't become a monolithic drape of fabric, of textile. So that little edge that sticks out. Now, chances are you're not wiping your nose with it or sneezing or doing anything chivalrous with it. It's just there as an accessory.
And so it shows personality.
Yeah.
Right? You know, another one, Chris, is socks. A lot of people dress super smart without the socks. They're looking like Agent Smith, but then you let character shine through.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing too. Socks or no socks, right? That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, and within the socks, you can get like fancy, colorful socks, even if they're in kind of monochrome colors.
Yeah, like you can get happy socks, which have crazy, wild, bold patterns. And so those are ways that you can say, like, it doesn't look like I'm paying attention and I just fell out of bed. But no, I am actually paying a lot of attention. So these little accessories are still in that kind of same design principle. Now we're just applying the same concept to fashion. So think of this type at the bottom, this footer type, as your pocket square. That's what it's doing for you. So repetition and contrast. Notice there are 3 groups of text that are 2 lines high. That brings some order to all of this. Okay. Back to the design problem, repetition. We have 3 elements on this page, not the stuff at the top and the bottom. And you can look at it like, well, this doesn't look very good. And so here's my next tip here. When you don't know what you're doing and you got to get a layout done pretty quickly, just align everything on one axis. So I'm going to use some of these tools here, align to selection. I'm going to click on this. Hold on, why didn't I do it? There we go. Okay. Now you're gonna be, oh, it just already feels a little bit better. And all it is the future and hot chicken again and our address. Okay. But you're gonna say, like, something still feels wrong about this. Tom, can you see what's wrong with this?
Is it the indented text?
Yeah, it is. Okay, remember
Nailed it.
I just threw you a softball and you knocked it out of the park.
I'm taking it.
Yeah, you should. Okay, it's the little indentation. So the indentation is interfering with me finding the sharp corners, and I want the sharp corners. I'm going to bring this one back. So one of the rules of typesetting is you never indent the first line of a paragraph. Okay, we're looking for this sharp line here where everything is anchored on, and that gives us a sense of order. It makes it a lot easier for us to read. And this is typically how things are typeset. You might have a little headline or byline, like who wrote the article, like it's written by. That's why it's called a byline. And then a little indent here. And that's the typical way of doing stuff. But I'm not a typical person, so I don't like that. I want to maintain this super sharp edge, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit delete, and we have a problem now. And the problem is, where's that paragraph? So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my paragraph. How come all this stuff is collapsed? And I'm going to add some space after the paragraph. So I'm going to add 15 points. I want to add enough where it's easy for you to spot the next paragraph. And that feels like it's about right for me. But not so much space that it's just eating up all the space in the layout, because every decision like this impacts the amount of pages that are being used for a book that you're designing.
Well, I noticed that paragraph break is less than the line height of the text. I think it is anyway, looking at that. Like if it was just if it was just an extra bit of text continued, it would be greater.
Yeah, so the leading right now, this is 24-point type for the sake of us not losing our eyesight looking at it on video, live streaming, is it's 28.8 leading with a 15-point paragraph break. Okay. And so it's looking better, and we're done. Voila. Or are we? Okay, well, because there are other elements on this page, I need to kind of align it so it'll look a little bit better. Now, you remember that Nike poster that people are, I don't like it. That's my annoying designer voice, all right? It's like the penguin. She, Batman. I don't know. Anyway, there it is.
Channeling your Danny DeVito right now.
Yeah, I don't like that. Well, it's bothering me. And then they see this, and so much better. But also not very interesting. Right? So we kind of have to figure out how to make it interesting while still making it legible. And so there's lots of things that we can do. There really are. Now we can we can look at the space. Like, is this too close? Yeah. Is it too far away? I don't know. But what's happening here, back to my brush here, we have to be aware of these spaces, that it's either going to be exactly the same distance apart, or it's going to be using that kind of 1/3 to 2/3 rule, right? So 1/3, 2/3. And then we start to get a sense of how this is going to work. But here, I'm going to try to make this like bold or something, so it's a little bit more interesting. Now, this is really boring body copy, and there's a lot of other things that we can do, but this is the kind of the task of the designer. And when you go through exercises to lay it out something like this 100 times, you're going to start to learn all the little nuances that you can do to it. So the future's there, but now that we have this really strong left alignment, this edge, I could take this and I can push it out, and it may not bother anybody. I can add rules in here to anchor and group things. There's a lot of little tricks that I can do now. But that's the thing about repetition, is to have something that we can pick up a pattern on, and then we break that pattern. So you could say that if you're reading this thing top to bottom, left to right, 1, 2, 3, break, 4. So it's not all the same. 1, 2, 3, break 4. 1, 2, 3, break 4. So it's kind of like that. And I often reference music, even though I cannot sing, I cannot play any instrument, because the principles are exactly the same. It's the space between the notes. That's where the music is.
Did you just take that full circle, Chris?
I think I did. It's called a bookend. I just try to like bring it together. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Chris, I've got a ton of respect for how much you give back to the design industry. Case in point, sessions like today. So a huge thank you from me and the rest of the team for joining me today. Massively appreciate it.
Tom.
Chris, I will chat to you soon, no doubt. Thank you again, buddy. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Take care. Bye, everybody. Thanks for attending the session.